I want to talk about hope in circumstances this morning as we go through Psalm 107. Why do we connect happiness so tightly to our circumstances? Why does it always seem like it is ebbing and flowing according to the things that are happening to us at the moment? Julianne Begini says this. She says, "No one is ever perfectly happy, and no one needs to be." She said, "Most people get by fine, without happiness. And so instead of focus on those things, focus on doing the things that matter the most." All right, so she says, stop focusing on happiness in your circumstances and start focusing on doing things that matter the most. Famous philosopher Thomas Nagel said this: "According to empirical studies, most people are happy most of the time." Profound thought statement. Terry Eagleton, "The problem is masked by the term happiness. Often shallow in meaning, happiness has a trite understanding for too many of us. When we dig deeper into the meaning of happiness, we might find something else resides there." The Roman poet Horace asked this question: "How comes it to pass that no one lives content with his condition?" And he concluded this: "All think that their own condition is the hardest." Psalm 107 is the first psalm in Book 5 of the Psalter. We've come almost all the way through the book of Psalms, and the first thing that you'll notice about this psalm, I want to just connect it really quick to the context. Psalm 107 is closely connected to Psalm 106 in your Bible. Psalm 106 and 107 start in almost the exact same way. We begin with this verse: "Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good, for his steadfast love endures forever." Almost verbatim in chapter 106 of Psalms and 107. Psalm 106 and 107 have the same focus. It's the same theme. It's the same emphasis. That theme is the steadfast love of the Lord, which endures forever. Psalm 106 and 107 not only have the same focus, not only start in the same way, but Psalm 106 is a recollection of Israel's history. Psalm 107 is the response to the recollection of Israel's history. They're tightly connected together because they share the same story, and the same principle should be taken from both of them. But there's one other characteristic of Psalm 107 that really drives the meaning not only of this psalm, but also it's the way I want to teach through it this morning in our outline. And the one thing that you're going to notice throughout this psalm, we didn't get a chance to read all of it, is repetition. There's a lot of repetition in Psalm 107. Repetition can be a very good thing. First, look down at verse 6. "Then they cried to the Lord in their trouble, and he delivered them from their distress." That verse right there is repeated verbatim 4 times in the psalm. Verse 13, verse 19, verse 28, and just right there at the beginning in verse 6. And the repetition tells us that God's people cry out to him, and he delivers them. Over and over again, 4 times in Psalm 107. That's the cycle. That's what happens. Second, look down at verse 8. "Let them thank the Lord for his steadfast love, for his wondrous works to the children of man." You're going to see that verse repeated 4 times in Psalm 107. You're also going to see it in verse 15, verse 21, and verse 31. That repetition tells us that gratitude to God for his steadfast love is paramount for the people of God. 4 times in chapter 107. Now, in 4 stanzas that we have laid out in Psalm 107, we see a very similar repetition. The people of God cry out to God, he delivers them from their distress, and there's gratitude for the steadfast love of the Lord that endures forever. The part that's different in all 4 circumstances, in all 4 stanzas, is the specific situation that the Israelites were in throughout their history. The circumstances and the situation changes. The repetition, the thanksgiving to God, the steadfast love of the Lord, crying out, God answering, it doesn't change. What changes is the circumstances. What changes is the context. So if you look in verse 4 of your text, it's going to start out this way. It says, "Some wandered in desert wastes, finding no way." Skip down to verse 10. "Some sat in darkness, prisoners in affliction." Skip down to verse 17. Some were fools through their sinful way. Skip down to verse 23. Some went down to the sea in ships, talking about the storms of life that they experienced. Whether God's people were wandering, slaving, suffering, or sinning, God was listening, loving, and redeeming them. In other words, despite the circumstances of his people that were always changing, God and his character never changed. Throughout Psalm 107, that's still true for us today. I want you to think about something as we talk about circumstances and hope. And I want you to go back to the very beginning. I want you to think about Genesis 3. I want you to think about the time when this perfect world that God created with man and woman to serve him, to worship him, to love him in a close fellowship relationship with one another was ruined the second that they did the one thing that God commanded them not to do. And now we have a fallen, sinful world because they disobeyed God. In Genesis 3:24, it says something like this. It says, he drove out the man, and at the east of the Garden of Eden, he placed the cherubim and a flaming sword that turned every way to guard the tree of life. And here's what Jerry Sitzer says in his book, A Grace Revealed, and I think this is worth pointing out. He said, God not only pushed Adam and Eve out of the garden, but he also refused to let them back in. And then he says this, which strikes me as odd or even perhaps mean. When that happened in Genesis 3, the security of the garden, the protection of the garden, the happiness of the circumstance in the garden, all of it was gone. And fallen mankind was left to live in a world of trials, of difficulty, of suffering, of pain, and of changing circumstances. Everything was ultimately going to be different. I have two questions this morning. Number one, why do some people land in one set of circumstances while other people don't? I have no idea the answer to that question. Number two, why do some people respond so differently to them from other people? Why do some people land in a set of circumstances that other people don't? And then why is the response to them so different depending on the person and depending on how God's working in their life? How can some people be ruined by circumstances while other people rise up in the midst of them? Why are some people wrecked by what's going on in their life and yet other people are renewed and restored by them? Psalm 107 is an appeal to God based on hope through changing circumstances in life. And here's what it says. No matter what circumstances you are facing, no matter the issues, the problems, the pain that you have in your life, no matter the success, the achievement, and the happiness that you have in your life, we always need hope from God. From a God who is never changing. When the world around us is constantly changing, regardless of our circumstances, we must hold on to a strong and firm hope that doesn't change in the person and work of Jesus Christ. Psalm 107 teaches us two things about hope in different circumstances. And here's your outline this morning. Number one, reading about hope is different from living it. Reading about hope is different than living it. Number two, circumstances can lead to hope, but they do not provide it. Circumstances can lead us to hope in God, but they do not provide that hope. Number one in your outline, number one this morning, reading about hope is different than living in it. Might seem simple enough, but I want you guys to think about this. Look down at verse 4 in your text, and let's reread verses 4 and 5. It says this. Here's the first changing circumstance, the first context in which the people of God cried out to God and were delivered. Verse 4, some wandered in desert wastes, finding no way to a city to dwell in. Hungry and thirsty, their soul fainted within them. The psalmist extended himself here to make a point in Psalm 107. God's people are in dire circumstances in these verses. And there's things in the text that really bring this out. These people of God are not traveling or journeying to a specific destination. They are not even meandering along the way. The Hebrew word for wandering in this text means that they have left the familiar path or they have lost the path entirely. When you think about the path in the Bible, think about Proverbs, think about wisdom literature. Psalm 107 is one of these chapters on wisdom through the Psalms. The Hebrew word for wandering here means that they have left a familiar past or path or lost it entirely. And as a result, they are in midbar, is the Hebrew. They are in the desert, waste places. They are in the wilderness. Now, when you think about Israel, here's what I want you to think about. When we think about the wilderness, we think about like deep forests, like something on the east side of Oklahoma where you're going up hills and valleys and everything is all around you with these thick, tall trees climbing through these different things. The wilderness for Israel was the desert. The wilderness was the waste place. It's the barren lands in Israel. And as a result of wandering, here the Israelites are in this waste place. Skip down to verse 10. Some sat in darkness and in the shadow of death, prisoners in affliction and in irons. Your text should read something like, some sat in utter darkness or deep darkness. That phrase emphasizes that their very life is being threatened in this context. When you see in your text, in affliction and in irons, that's a two-part phrase with one specific meaning. It's kind of like saying a person is good and angry. It's one picture, it's one thing that's being said with two parts to it. In this case, the chains are contributing to the affliction of the people of God in the context in verse 10. Look down at verse 23 through 26. Verse 23, some went down to the sea in ships, doing business on the great waters. They saw the deeds of the Lord, his wondrous works in the deep. For he commanded and raised the stormy wind, which lifted up the waves of the sea. They mounted up to heaven, and they went down to the depths. You're going to read 3 words for the sea in those verses right there. Number 1, the great waters, verse 23. Verse 24, it says the deep. Verse 26, it says the depths. All those words, maybe from Jonah, indicate this uncontrollable, chaotic mass of water that nobody can tame, that nobody can be sovereign over except for our God. If we went through our Old Testament, we could identify and read almost all of these stories from Israel's past. We know the time that they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. We know the stories of Jonah. We know the times that they were in suffering and in chains and bound. Some were imprisoned like Joseph. And look, God delivered them. Some were sinful like David and foolish, and God healed him. Some experienced storms like Jonah, and God saved them. When we read these stories, we stand. Here's the thing. We read these stories on our side of the cross, in our present day context, and we know how these stories pan out. We stand outside the sequence of time when we read them. We are reading from a very privileged position. And here's what you could do when you approach any of those stories in the Bible. You could skip immediately from Genesis 1 and 2 right over to Revelation 21 and 22. You could skip from Jonah chapter 1 and go right to the end of Jonah chapter 4 and see, hey, some kind of way he makes it out and he is delivered from the sea monster. You can read the story of David Bathsheba and you can see the end of his life and you can see what happened as a result of it. When we read a story, we stand outside of it. But when we live a story, we are inside of it. And you and I don't have the same luxury that we have as if we were reading a story. The reason is really simple. We're not at the end of our story. We are right in the middle of it. And so here's what Jerry Sitzer says again in his book, A Grace Revealed. He says, we bear the imprint of the past with no power to change it. We look at the future with no power to control it. We are confined to the present, whether it is ideal or whether it is miserable. We are not readers outside of a story when it comes to hope in God. We are right in the middle of a story. We are characters in that story. And listen, I really wish there was another way. I really wish I could tell people that are going through suffering, like, hey, this is how it's going to end for you. God's going to redeem this situation in this specific way. I wish I could tell Mary Anderson, maybe one day she's not going to be as lonely without Jim. But the thing is, predictability isn't always good for a Christian. Control isn't always the answer. And happiness isn't always circumstantial. And it shouldn't depend on the ending of your earthly story. It should depend on something completely different. Because why? Living in a story is very different from reading it. Hoping in God in the present tense is different than finding hope in a past tense story of what he has done in the past. We have no choice but to let the mystery of life unfold. And unfold it will. But as it unfolds, it's going to require at least two things from us. It's going to require faith that we trust God, his character, and what he's doing in our hearts and our lives. And it's going to require hope that's beyond our circumstances, no matter what we're going through, because reading about hope is different from living it. Number two, circumstances in life can lead to hope, but they do not provide it. Circumstances in life can lead to hope, but they do not provide it. Are any of you Malcolm Gladwell fans out there? You guys know Malcolm, a couple hands are up here. You read his book, Outliers. Outliers is an interesting book by Malcolm Gladwell. He wrote this and he challenged some of the assumptions that we have about successful people in life. Most of us look out and we might see a successful person and we say, well, they're successful because of this reason, because of that reason, and that reason. And Malcolm Gladwell kind of researched that out a little bit, and he thought, and he concluded that success in life might be a little bit different than we assume on a normal basis. So we play some sports in our family. We love to play sports. And one thing that you're going to notice about people who are successful in sports as kids, if you've got a really dominant athlete, it is easy to notice them. And one of the trends you'll also notice about them is usually if you're playing in a U14 team or a U16, 16-year-old and under, usually the most dominant athletes in that age group are the ones that are the oldest in the age bracket. So if you're playing a 16U team, you could have two kids going up against each other that are literally 11 months difference from their birth age. And most of the time, the older kid has a little bit more strength, maturity, and growth and advantage over the younger guys. 1 year makes a complete difference. Some of you look out and you see a really gifted leader who seems smarter, ahead of things, better, and more capable than others. Most of the time, Malcolm Gladwell says, you know what? It's not that they're smarter, more capable, or more gifted IQ. Some of them just grew up working really hard on farms, and they know the value of hard work and work ethic. And so that separates them off from other people. There are so many factors to success that we don't know about. You can't just boil it down to 3 simple steps. Do this, you'll achieve that, or follow this recipe, and this is going to be the result of it. Sometimes we are tempted to think that the most hopeful people are those whose circumstances have turned out the best. Sometimes we're tempted to think that the most hopeless people are those whose circumstances have turned out for the worst, but that is not always the case in life and in Scripture. Like we said, all the circumstances in Psalm 107 are completely different. All the outcomes to the circumstances are slightly different. The only thing that stays constant, the only thing that's the same, is the Lord is working through each of them differently at different times with a different set of people. Verse 6 and 7, look at your text. It says, they cried out to the Lord in their trouble. And that verb for cry out in the Old Testament, it is used repeatedly, especially in contexts associated with the Exodus. The people of God cried out, and the Lord heard them in their affliction. God saved them by bringing them to a city on a smooth or a straight road. The result of this, verse 7, is that they reached a city to dwell in. In verses 10 through 14, the circumstance was slavery, it was imprisonment, it was chains. God saved them by bursting their bonds in verse 14. That Hebrew verb is very unique. It is written in a stem that means literally their chains were torn apart and shattered into pieces. It builds the frequency of the verb and the intensity of the verb, you might say. The longest stanza, I want you to think about this, the longest stanza in Psalm 107, the longest stanza is the stanza about the Lord calming the sea. You're going to read it in verses 23 through 32. And here's what's interesting because you see the Lord a little bit differently in this context. Look at verse 25. For he commanded and raised the stormy wind, which lifted up the waves of the sea. Who's the he referring to there? That's referring to God and God's sovereignty. One commentator on this verse, he said this: unlike the two previous scenes, which explain disaster in light of the people's rebellion, the final scene attributes both cause of the storm and solution to the storm to God. He both caused it and he solved it for the people in that context. It's easy to see God in deliverance for his people. It's much harder to see him in the problems, the circumstances that we encounter. Look at verse 27. They reeled and staggered like drunken men, and they were at their wits' end. Literally in Hebrew, all their wisdom was swallowed up. Maybe a reference to Jonah right there in verse 27. This is what I'm trying to say. All of our circumstances are different. And when we go through different circumstances, that's why it's so important to have a constant, unchanging hope in the Lord. And I've got to explain this deeper just to understand it better, because it's one thing to say this, it's another thing to walk through it in life. You might be single here today and wish that you were married. And you're thinking to yourself, if I'm married, all of my problems go away, right? Everybody that's married who's yep. See, the audience is answering or preaching it for me. I don't even have to say anything. You might be here looking for employment. Maybe you need a job. You might be here, you have employment. Maybe you want to quit your job and get out of it. You might really love your life right now, really love it. And you want everything to stay the same. You might hate your life right now and wish every aspect of it would change immediately today, right now. It's easy for me to stand up and say this at the age that I'm at and going through what I've gone through. And I don't want it to sound insensitive. I don't mean for it to sound insensitive, but here's what Psalm 107 is saying. Circumstances play such a limited role in your life and in your hope for God. Circumstances play such a limited role. Life just is. There's so much that we can't control. We have no power over when we are living day by day, week by week, season by season, year by year. If you are married or if you're single, if you are rich or if you are poor, if you are healthy, if you are sick, if you are successful, if you're not so successful. I definitely have my preferences that I would enjoy in a fallen world. But at some point in time, the power to choose ends for us as finite human beings. At some point in time, we have to acknowledge that God is God and we are not. Sometimes there are reasons for the things that happen to us, and we should slow our lives down and ask some deeper questions, especially when the same things happen to us over and over again. That might be an indicator that something's going on in our heart and in our lives, and God's trying to get our attention. I don't know. We would be wise to think about those things. We would be unwise to dwell on them super long. You can't change the future. You can't change the past. You have today, and that's all you have, besides God and his grace. At the end of the day, from season to season, year to year, life simply happens. And there is so much more things that are important to you, that should be important to you, much more important than what happens to you. What's much more important is how you respond to the things that happen to you. It's how your attitude is shaped and your heart is conformed to Christ through those things that are beyond our control. If the Apostle Paul were here today and he was reading Psalm 107 for us, here's what he might say. He might say something like this: I know how to live with little, I know how to live with much. In any and every circumstance, I have learned the secret of facing plenty and having hunger, and abundance and having need. If Solomon was here, he might say it a little bit differently. He might say something like this: I built houses for myself, I planted vineyards for myself, I planted a forest for myself. Solomon planted a forest. I have enough trouble keeping my trees alive in my yard he planted a forest, okay? He says, I amassed silver, I amassed gold, the delights of a man's heart, I denied myself of nothing. And his conclusion is vanity of vanities, all of it is meaningless. What is left for a man to do under the sun? Solomon didn't just battle meaninglessness. Solomon battled the disappointment of success in life and where that leads you. Circumstances must play a limited role if you are going to find hope in this world. Circumstances must play a limited role if you're going to find hope in a God who is unchanging in a world that is fallen, broken, sinful, and temporary. A couple things to think about as we finish up with Psalm 107. Number one, life is constantly changing. God is always working. Number one, life is constantly changing. Circumstances are always changing in your life, but God is always working. Life is never static, not even when it seems to be. Are you a creature of habit? You wake up at the same time every morning? Do you eat the same meal? I've been eating eggs and blueberries for the last 15 years of my life. I'm hoping one day that I'll, have a lot of protein in my body and remember things. They say blueberries are good for memory, right? Life is never static. God is always taking you somewhere. God is always shaping you in some way. He's working on some area, or he is restoring and redeeming something in your heart and life. God is always taking you somewhere, shaping you in some way, working in some area, or restoring something in your heart and life. Contrary to what it might seem, the story of your life has meaning, purpose, direction, and a goal. And all of those things are the necessary ingredients to walking in hope, no matter what you're going through in life. Listen, it's really easy for me to say this. Again, it's harder for me to live it. We need adversity in our life. At least some of the time, we need adversity. At least some of the time. Trials expose our weaknesses. They identify our selfishness. Trials enlarge our smallness in this world. And they teach us about our desperate need for God. This is the terrible conundrum that we face. Those who truly experience hopelessness are taking the first steps to finding hope in this life. Those who've finally been dissatisfied with the world are going to find satisfaction with God for the very first time. Because why? We stop looking for it in someone or something other than God. We stop looking for that in the world, and we start looking for it only in God, and only in an eternal relationship with an all-knowing, all-holy God who loves you, who died for you on the cross. One theologian put it this way. He said this: faith is not faith when it wills and gets what it wants. Faith is only faith when it depends on God and not on self. Faith is not faith when it sees, wills, and gets what it wants. Faith is only faith when it depends on God and not self. Hope is only hope when you long for something, not when you have it. As believers, we live a redemptive story because God is in it. He wrote this story for us, but he also entered into our story, and we know how it ends. Romans 8:28 is going to say something like this: God works all things together for those who love him, for those who are called according to his purpose. No matter what you are going through right now, you can have hope in a God who is unchanging. No matter how much your circumstances have been altered and changed, God never changes, and so we can trust him. We can place our hope ultimately in him. Number 2, God is redeeming the story of your life. Make sure you tell it. God is redeeming the story of life. Make sure you tell it. Look up at verse 2, Psalm 107. Let the redeemed of the Lord say so. You want something to do as you're struggling through this fallen world? Talk to people about your story. Talk to people about the areas of your heart that God has redeemed. Let the redeemed of the Lord say so, whom he has redeemed from trouble and gathered in from the lands, from the east and from the west, from the north and from the south. The word redeemed there is the Hebrew word ga'al, and it means to be freed with a purchase price, to be freed by a payment. Redeemed Israelites were freed from Egypt. They were freed from slavery. It reminds us of freedom in the book of Ruth and the promised Redeemer that goes all the way back to Genesis chapter 3, that he would crush the head of the serpent. Notice here in your text, east and west are partnered syntactically with north and south. And that's not saying vertical is aligned and horizontal is aligned. Here's what that's saying. To the west of Israel was the chaotic sea. To the east was the desert. To the south of Israel was Egypt, and to the north was Babylon. Those were the people who took them to slavery and took them captive and put them in exile. God rescued his people no matter what situation they were in, no matter what direction they were headed. He took them and he redeemed them out of their trouble. He has redeemed them in the past. He will redeem them in the future. He can be trusted because he never changes. Psalm 107 tells us as believers, God has redeemed you. He is in the process of redeeming you. And so go tell people about it. Let the redeemed of the Lord say so. When you find yourself in circumstances that God has redeemed, tell other people about it. Number 3, hope grows proportionately to our gratitude for God's goodness. Hope typically grows proportionately with our gratitude for God's goodness. In Romans 1, there's an interesting phrase here. It talks about sin, and it says that their futile hearts were darkened because they failed to give God thanks. One of the true tested signs that sin is embedded in your heart is ingratitude. It's failure to give God thanks. And so when you are feeling truly hopeless in the world, and that is probably going to happen at some point this year if it hasn't already, there are seasons we all suffer through them. We all go through them. I want you to ask yourself a few questions. Number 1, are my feelings more concerned about this world, or are they centered on the world to come? Are the feelings that I'm experiencing at any given moment in life, are they more concerned about this world, or they're focused on the kingdom in the world to come? There's a really interesting phrase in Hebrews chapter 11, and talks about the hall of faith, those who had faith to do incredible things. And it says something like that the world was not worthy of them. Remember that phrase? Oftentimes, I think we struggle with hopelessness because our mind, our thoughts, and our feelings are so stuck in this world that we can't even step for a second out to think about the world to come, eternity, and our relationship with God. Number 2, if your perspective is difficult today, how might your perspective change 5 years from now? Maybe 10 years from now, 15 years from now, or 20 years. If your perspective is difficult and hard today in life and hopeless, how might it change 5, 10, 15, or 20 years from now? They say that in marriage, if your marriage is going through a hard time, if you will simply stick it out for 5 years, whatever that situation is, whatever that issue that is coming between you and your spouse, 5 years from now, think about all the different things that could take place. Think about the career changes. Think about the difficulties, the pain, the trials that you're going through. 5 years from now, it's going to be totally different. If you can just stick it out, chances are your marriage can make it through that thing or that issue or whatever it is. Number 3, if I was reading my story from above, how would it be different from living it below? If I was reading my story today from above, how would it be different from living it below? And let me put that in different words. If you could see your life from a 30,000-foot perspective and look down and just see all the things that have happened and see all the things that are going to happen to you, how would your perspective be different about your situation that you're going through right now if you can see it from an eternal viewpoint, above and beyond all of those things? Circumstances are shifting, they're tricky, it's hard to understand what God could be doing when we're going through them. But if you can back away just for a second and see the person and work of Jesus, see the promises of God, and see the eternal reward that's yet to come in your future, it puts everything in a completely different perspective. Every aspect, every hard thing, every trial that you are going through is significant and it matters to God. And he is not asking us how we're in control of those things. He's asking us, how are you going to respond to those things? So Jesus is the prime example for us, right? In Psalm 107, we can see there's a distinct pattern in Psalm 107. I want you to see one other thing before we close here. We've got time just for one more point. In Psalm 107, at the very end, from verse 33 through 43, there's 2 different paragraphs, 33 through 36, 33 through 38, and then 39 through 43. At the beginning of both of those paragraphs talk about difficulties and how some people respond to God in difficult situations or by what he has brought before them. And there's another response to God at the end of both of those paragraphs. Look at verse 33. He turns rivers into a desert, springs of water into a thirsty ground, fruitful land into a salty waste because of the evil of its inhabitants. That's one thing that God does. God will sometimes take great bounty, blessings, and amazing things in life, and he will take them away from us for whatever reason. Sometimes he does, sometimes he doesn't. Verse 35. He turns a desert into pools of water, parched land into springs of water, and there he lets the hungry dwell, and they establish a city to live in. Sometimes God takes comfort, prosperity, and peace and brings chaos and disorder. Sometimes he takes brokenness, humility, and shamefulness, and he brings exaltation, he brings reward, and he brings beauty out of it. We don't know through the circumstances of life, but we know how the heart should respond in all those situations. Look at verse 39. When they are diminished and brought low through oppression, evil, and sorrow, he pours contempt on princes and makes them wander in trackless wastes. But, verse 41, he raises up the needy out of affliction. He makes their families like flocks. The upright see it and are glad, and all wickedness shuts its mouth. Whoever is wise, let him attend to these things. There's something about brokenness that leads us to hope when our hearts are softened to the things of God. And God will do whatever it takes to break us of ourselves, to bring us to that point of brokenness so that we might see hope in him alone, and nothing else in this world. Jesus is the prime example. Jesus had everything. Jesus is God of gods. He left the glories above. He forsook it. He humbled himself to obedience, even death on a cross. And in that humility, God raised him up through it. He is the one we look to whose circumstances were terrible. He is the one that we can look to and say, Jesus, we will never go through circumstances like Jesus went through. He took on the wrath of God. And yet God exalted him through those things. And he knew and entrusted himself to a good God who is able to deliver. Let's pray and close it out.